Welcome back to Myth Madness, and my exploration of Persian mythology. Most of this season will discuss stories found in the Shahnameh, an epic poem written in 1010 AD by a man named Ferdowsi. It is the best source of Persian myths, and is arranged in chronological order, starting with the first king and covering the next generations. Up to now, the first few stories were more mythic in nature. The kings were culture heroes, responsible for founding civilization, and there were monsters and other strange, otherworldly things. But now, the Shahnameh switches its approach. It will focus less on the Persian king, and instead on his interactions with his vassal nobles, and all of their struggles against external human enemies. History is full of conflict that arises when one leader hands power to the next, and mythology is no exception. In past episodes, I talked about how a man named Feridun came to rule the world, and how he ushered in a golden age. However, the time of prosperity doesn't last. You see, Feridun had 3 sons, Salm, Tur, and Iraj. And he made a fateful decision, a mistake, when he decided to divide the world among those sons. Salm he made king of Rum, the west. To Tur he granted the crown of Turan, the wide fields and high mountains that make up Asia to the north and east of Iran. And finally, to Iraj, he bestowed the rich, esteemed lands of Iran, the top prize. Salm and Tur were enraged by this. Iraj was their younger brother, and their father had made him the higher king of the 3. One of them should have been paramount, or at the very least received Iran as his share instead. Salm and Tur plotted to depose Iraj, but their younger brother was so innocent, he actually offered to give them Iran, no questions asked. But Salm and Tur were not so easily soothed. They betrayed their brother and killed him. And to add insult to injury, they sent his severed head back to their father Feridun. In the Shahnameh, Tur's murder of his brother Iraj is a great crime that kicks off a feud between the 2 countries Iran, or Persia, and Turan. A great war was fought. Salm and Tur were killed, but in the process, the land of Turan was devastated. This devastation, from the Turanians' perspective, was its own great crime. A terrible cycle of vengeance between the 2 nations had begun to turn. It will continue for many generations, spinning out tragedy after tragedy throughout Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. This episode will cover the Turanians' first attempts to have their own twisted justice against Persia. But first, the mythical opposition between Iran and Turan is very old and actually predates Ferdowsi's epic poem. Both countries are mentioned in the Yashts, sacred hymns included in the Avesta, a larger collection of ancient Zoroastrian religious texts. And many of the Shahnameh's stories have roots going back to the Avesta, making these texts another great source for Iranian myths and legends. In the Avestan Yashts, various Iranian tribes are named, such as the Aryaz, which is the origin of the word Iran, and the Turiyaz, which gives the word Turan. The Turiyaz are typically treated as enemies of the Aryaz. Centuries later, during the time of the Sassanid Persian Empire, the opposition between Iran and Turan was defined more clearly. Turan was viewed as a fierce enemy of Persia. It was a land full of barbarians. This reflected the real-world situation at the time. One of the greatest threats to the Sassanid Empire were frequent invasions by nomadic tribes from the north, from Turan. Over time, the Turanians were identified with Turkic people. Starting in the 6th century AD, Turkic tribes migrated from deeper areas of Asia and entered parts of Central Asia closer to Iran. In the centuries afterwards, people speaking Turkic languages slowly became the dominant groups in most of Central Asia. What this means is that in Iran, or Persia, in the 10th and 11th centuries when Ferdowsi and others were writing their epic poems, they looked at their Turkic-speaking neighbors to the north and linked them with the legendary inhabitants of Turan. Ferdowsi even calls the Turanians Turks at various points of the Shahnameh. Throughout this podcast and in future episodes, I will use the term Turanians to refer to the people living in Turan, and Persians, or Iranians, for people from Persia or Iran. I will often use the word Persia instead of Iran when I'm talking about the feud between the two nations, as it's easier to distinguish Persia from Turan. Anyway, after avenging Iraj's death, Manichir lived for 120 years. At the end of his life, his astrologers and sages saw that his life would end soon, and that his far, the radiant blessing of the Creator that all the worthy Iranian kings possessed, had dimmed. The sages went to him reluctantly and told him it was time to prepare to leave the world. Taking their advice, Manichir had his son Nozar brought to him. He spoke to the prince for an extended period of time. Manichir's advice was that the royal throne should be thought of as an illusion and not treated as an end in itself. Manichir told Nozar he had been inspired by Feridun, had fought against Sam and Tur, founded cities and built fortresses and endured pain and sorrow. Now it was time to pass all of that to Nozar. As he lay on his deathbed, Manichir told Nozar to seek counsel from the Creator, be humble and righteous. Finally, as his eyes began to close, Manichir warned Nozar that Persia's enemies would come soon, and would arrive as wolves, but also sheep. With that grim advice, Manichir died, and Nozar became king of Iran. At first, Nozar sat on the throne, holding court and distributing wealth to his people in a fair way. But a few days in, he began to turn away from justice. He became greedy, cruel, and despised his priests and advisors. Pretenders to the throne and rebellions were not far behind. Soon the whole kingdom was in turmoil, and Nozar feared for his throne. He sent a messenger to Sam, who was battling foreign armies in faraway Gorg-Saran, and begged him for help. When Nozar's letter reached Sam, he let out a long sigh. In the Shahnameh, Sam is always away fighting enemies in Gorg-Saran or some other place and being called home. Once again, he would have to leave his military campaign. He couldn't make any progress if he kept getting interrupted. Sam left Gorg-Saran and led his army to the borders of Persia. He found a large group of nobles waiting for him. They told him that Nozar was not behaving like a just king, and had abandoned the policies of his father Manichir. The nobles asked Sam to not prop up Nozar's rule. In fact, they went a step further. They offered the throne to Sam instead. Sam told them that he would not take the throne. It was not the Creator's will, and it would not be right as Persia already had a king, and even if it didn't and the throne was vacant, Sam would support a daughter of Manichir on the throne before himself. Sam told the nobles that instead of looking for new kings, they should reaffirm their loyalty to Nozar, and he would work to restore the king's right to rule. Thanks to Sam, the nobles regretted turning against the king. Nozar's legitimacy was restored, and Sam advised him on how to act justly before returning once again to fight in Gorg-Saran. Meanwhile, news of Manichir's death and Nozar's troubles reached the ruler of Turan. This was a man named Pashang. His father was Zadsham, and Pashang's grandfather was Tur. Yes, the same Tur who killed Iraj and was later slain by Manichir. As you can imagine, this did not sit well with the ruling family of Turan. Zadsham and Pashang had spent years being bitter over Tur's death and the destruction Manichir's army brought to Turan. They wanted to right what they considered historical wrongs. They wanted revenge, and Pashang now saw his chance to get it. So Pashang summoned his nobles and chieftains and told them the time to invade Iran had finally arrived. Pashang's favorite champion, his own son Afrasyab, was inflamed by his father's words. He agreed with his father and wanted to end Turan's shame through conquest. Afrasyab was ready to lead the army to glory. But while Afrasyab was in total agreement with his father, his brother, and Pashang's other son, Agrirus, was worried. Agrirus went to his father and warned him that even with Manichir dead and Nozar weak, Persia was not undefended. Sam still commanded the army. Zal reigned in Sistan, and old heroes like Gawran would still be dangerous opponents. Gawran especially, since it was he who had ensured the defeat of Tur and Som years before. Pashang told Agriras that Afrasyab was like a lion on the hunt, and anyone who did not seek revenge for his family was not worthy of that family. Pashang said Agriras should join Afrasyab on the campaign and advise his brother. He told Agriras to take an army to a place called Dahistan and try to fight Gawran there. Agriras agreed. In the spring, Afrasyab's armies were ready. Warriors came from across Turan and joined him. They made their way to the Oxus River, the boundary between Persia and Turan. Gawran led the Persian armies to meet them. Afrasyab gave a portion of his army to his commanders Shamashash and Kazbaran. He instructed them to march to Sistan and attack Zal. Sam had recently died, and the Turanians believed Zal would be busy building Sam's tomb. The rest of the Turanian army, including Agriras, and the Persian army under Gawran finally came together at Dahistan. One famed Turanian warrior named Barman asked Afrasyab if he could challenge one of the Persians' commanders to single combat. Agriras cautioned Afrasyab against this. If a hero like Barman was defeated, then their whole army would lose morale. He suggested they send out an anonymous warrior instead. Afrasyab was not impressed. He thought Agriras' advice was shameful. He told Barman to go ahead. Barman went out into the empty field between the two armies. He yelled at Gawran and said he was looking for a warrior to fight in single combat. Gawran waited for one of the Persian men to step forward, but the only one who did was Gawran's brother, Gobad. Gawran told Gobad he was too old to fight against a young, strong warrior like Barman. Gobad was an important Persian leader. If he died, the army's men would despair. But Gobad insisted. He said warriors lived to wear their helmets in battle, and if his fate was to die, then so be it. He had lived a long life. Then he grabbed his spear and rode out to face Barman. Gobad and Barman fought their duel from dawn to dusk. They both fought well, but eventually Barman struck Gobad in the back with a lance. The old hero's spine was broken, and he fell from his horse to lie dead in the dirt. Barman returned victorious to Afrasyab, and Gawran charged the Persians forward like the tide of a great ocean. Dust rose in the sky, and the ground became slick with blood. Gawran rode his horse back and forth, slashing with his sword as he went. When Afrasyab saw him, he charged forward looking for a fight. They came so close together they could look each other in the eyes. Afrasyab wove a magic spell. Light turned to darkness, and day passed into night. Gawran's arm became so heavy he was unable to strike. The two armies and the two generals pulled apart and rested for the night. The following morning the battle began again. By this time the Persian king Nozar had arrived, and he rode out to fight Afrasyab. They threw spears at each other and dodged one another's blows. But by nightfall, Nozar could see Afrasyab and the Turanians were getting the upper hand. The Persians fled to their side of the field. Back at the camp, Nozar summoned his sons Tus and Gostam. He told them Manichir had predicted the coming of Afrasyab and how he feared for Iran's future. Nozar told them to secretly leave the army and return to Pars in western Iran. There, they were to collect Nozar's family and take them to safety in the Alborz mountains. He told Tus and Gostam he didn't know if he would ever see them again, and all three wept as they said their goodbyes. 3 days later, Afrasyab's forces had spent a whole night in preparation, and the two armies battled again. At the same time, Afrasyab gave special instructions to a commander named Karakan. He told this man to lead some warriors down a desert road leading deep into Persia. Once behind the Persian army, Karakan would be free to capture the Persian supply lines and their leaders' families. When spies and scouts reported this to Gawran, he ran to Nozar in a panic. He warned the king that if their families were captured, the commanders would panic and defeat would surely follow. Gawran volunteered to chase Karakan down and stop him, but Nozar strongly declined. Gawran was his best commander, and he couldn't hope to fight against Afrasyab's main army without him. the king told Gawran that he had already sent Tus and Gostam back to Pars. They would be able to stop Karakan without him. Gawran was calmed, at least temporarily. When he left Nozar and returned to his tents, he found it full of hand-wringing, worried Persian soldiers. They told him they could not accept Nozar's proposal. They needed to go back to Pars themselves. They were too worried about their families. Gawran discussed what to do with the Persian heroes Shiroi and Keshvad. The three of them decided to leave for Pars in the middle of the night. Along the way, they passed a castle. As luck would have it, Barman, the warrior who had killed Gawran's brother Gobad in single combat, was laying siege to the castle on behalf of Afrasyab. Gawran wanted revenge. He killed Barman, forced his troops to retreat, saved the castle, and then continued on with Shiroi and Keshvad. But back at the main battlefield, when the Persian army learned of Gawran's departure, it began to disintegrate. Nozar left the battlefield and led some troops to follow Gawran. When Afrasyab heard about this, he in turn led his army to pursue Nozar. He caught up to the Persians, killed many of them, and took the rest captive. He captured Nozar and bound him in chains. Shortly afterwards, he had Nozar brought before him and executed the Iranian king by cutting off his head. The Persian commanders had traded preventing the possibility of their families being captured with the loss of their king. Afrasyab was now, for all intents and purposes, king of Iran. Meanwhile, the army Afrasyab sent to Sistan finally arrived there. As the Turanians expected, Zal was preoccupied mourning the death of his father Sam, so Zal's father-in-law Mehrab was running Sistan for him. When Mehrab heard of the approach of Turan's army, he sent its leader Shamashas a message. Mehrab told Shamashas that he hoped Afrasyab was king forever. Mehrab was descended from the old tyrant Zahak, and he didn't care for Zal or the Iranian royal family. Mehrab hoped Shamashas would give him time to reach out to Afrasyab and hand over rule of Sistan directly to him. But it was a trick. Mehrab was only playing for time. He sent a messenger to Zal to tell him an army had arrived from Turan, and he should not waste any time. Zal received Mehrab's warning and gathered his own army. They sneaked their way to the enemy camp, and in the dead of night Zal took out his bow, 3 arrows each as big as tree branches, and shot them into Shamashas's camp. This caused chaos throughout the camp, and Shamashas blamed his fellow commander Kazbaran for not dealing with Zal sooner. Zal led his men into battle. Kazbaran viciously fought against Zal and broke his breastplate with his mace. But Zal only went away, got new armor, and then came back in a fury. He smashed Kazbaran's head with a mace, and then called for Shamashas to come out of hiding and fight him too. Shamashas took one look at Zal's mace and made his escape. The Turanian army was defeated and retreated from Sistan. Later, Zal heard about the death of Nozar. He swore vengeance against Afrasyab and the warriors of Turan. News of Zal's preparations eventually came to a place called Sari, where Afrasyab's brother, Agriras, had a castle. Previously, after Afrasyab's execution of the Persian king, Agriras tried to convince his brother that he should spare the other captive Persians, as killing more would be unjust. Agriras promised to take them away, and imprison them in a dark cave under the Sari castle. Afrasyab had agreed. The prisoners learned that Zal had remobilized the Iranian army, and that Gawran and some other Persian heroes had already joined him. The prisoners were very distressed. They worried that if Zal attacked, which was only a matter of time, Afrasyab would order them killed, so they begged Agriras to set them free. Agriras declined. He did not agree with how his brother was conducting the war, but he couldn't betray him like that. But Agriras told the prisoners that if Zal attacked Sari, he would immediately hand them over. Happy with this and hoping it actually happened, the prisoners then sent a message to Zal, telling him what Agriras had said. Zal sent an army, and the prisoners were freed. But when Agriras returned to Afrasyab's base of operations, his brother knew what he had done. They argued, and a furious Afrasyab lashed out with his sword and cut Agriras in two. Meanwhile, with the army rebuilt and some parts of the kingdom back in Persian control, Zal led the combined forces to Pars. It was time to crown a new king of Iran, but this was not to turn out that simple. Nozar had two sons named Tus and Gostam. Technically, they were next in line and had the best claims to the throne. Yet, there was a problem. They were not considered worthy. Tus, in particular, was known to be arrogant, impulsive, and quick to anger. Zal told the other nobles that they needed to find someone who had the divine far, the Creator's blessing, and eventually they settled on offering the throne to a man named Zav. Zav was a cousin of Tus and Gostam, and a grandson of the old king Manichir, so still a member of the royal family. When Zal and Garin offered him the throne, Zav agreed. But Zav was already an old man. He was 80 years old, and he only ended up ruling for 5 more years. In that time, he brought back justice and goodness and saved Persia from Turan's might. Zav had some outside help. Shortly after he ascended the throne, a terrible famine had broken out and spread across the world. The armies of Persia and Turan still marched across the land, but they did not fight each other as the warriors were too weak from not eating. Eventually, Zav received a message from Afrasyab. The prince of Turan wanted peace. They should stop fighting and agree that the Oxus River acted as the border between Turan and Persia. Zav agreed, and Afrasyab led his army home. Afrasyab led the army over the Oxus River and back into Turan. His father, Pashang, the king of Turan, did not welcome him home. In fact, Pashang ignored Afrasyab for an entire year. The king's mind was filled with hatred for Persia, and he was disappointed and angry that Afrasyab had ended the fighting. He was also angry about the death of Agriras. Pashang told Afrasyab he didn't want to see him ever again. Years passed, and Zav, the new king of Iran, died. Pashang once again saw his chance and broke his silence. He ordered Afrasyab to build an army once again. He was to cross the Oxus River and invade Persia before a new king ascended the throne. When the Persians learned Afrasyab's army had crossed the border, they turned to Zal in a panic. By this time, Zal was much older, and his son Rostam had grown into a strong, tall warrior. The two of them would lead the Persian army in the defense of the realm. The two great opposing armies met at a place called Ray. They made their camps but did not fight right away. Zal told the other lords that the army was not yet of one mind, and that was because the throne was empty. He told them that they needed a king that belonged to the royal family, who possessed the divine far, and who was fit to lead, being wise and just. He told them that Kay Kawad was such a man, but Kay Kawad was not there. He lived in the Alborz Mountains. So Zal turned to Rostam and instructed his son to get on his horse, ride into the mountains, find Kay Kawad, and bring him to the army's camp at Ray. Zal told Rostam that he needed to do this within 2 weeks, as the army needed their new king to lead them into battle as soon as possible. Last episode, I retold some stories about Rostam's youth that were not in the Shahnameh. This fetching of Kay Kawad is the Shahnameh's first real Rostam adventure. The young hero returned with Kay Kawad, and for 7 days Kay Kawad sat in council with Zal and other advisors discussing the state of Persia and plans for the coming battle. His presence in the camp was kept secret. On the 8th day, an ivory throne was brought out, and Kay Kawad crowned himself in front of the assembled warriors. All of Persia's heroes were there, and they scattered handfuls of jewels on the ground in front of their new king. After that, Kay Kawad led the Persian armies to battle, and he was joined by all the great Iranian heroes, Zal, Rostam, Garin, and even Mehrab, the king of Kabul. The plains and the mountainsides became a mass of shields and swords, glittering like 100,000 candles. Once the great battle started, Rostam turned to Zal and asked his father where in the opposing army was Afrasyab likely to be, and what did he look like. Zal warned Rostam to be careful, and that Afrasyab fought like a fire-breathing dragon. The Prince of Turan dressed in a suit of black iron armor, and he carried a banner that was black too. Zal told Rostam that if he saw Afrasyab, he should stay away from him. As it happened, in the next cavalry charge, Afrasyab saw Rostam and asked his companions who he was. He was told the young warrior was Zal's son, that he fought with his grandfather Sam's mace, and was eager, strong, and brave. Afrasyab decided to fight him, and rode ahead of his army to bring him closer to Rostam. Rostam didn't shy away, and he charged his own horse, Raksh, forward. He pulled out his mace and attacked the Turanian prince with it. When he got close enough, he reached out his hand and grabbed Afrasyab's belt. Rostam lifted him out of the saddle and raised him into the air. He wanted to take his enemy back to Kay Kawad, but Afrasyab's weight and Rostam's strength were too much for the belt. The leather split, and Afrasyab fell to the ground. It was just the opportunity the Turanian warriors needed. Seeing their prince on the ground and out of Rostam's grip, they hurried forward and got between him and the Iranian hero. They rescued their leader, and Afrasyab escaped. However, Rostam's actions still proved good for the Persians. Kay Kawad saw Afrasyab's banner fall into the dirt, and he ordered his whole army charge forward. With their leader out of the fight, the Turanian army began to retreat. They left Persia and crossed back over the border. Back in Turan, Afrasyab went to his father Pashang and told him what happened. He told Pashang that his quest for vengeance had ended in failure. Persia had a new king, and one still descended from Iraj. What's more, Persia had a new champion, Rostam, and he fought fiercely, like some hideous monster. Afrasyab told Pashang that Rostam had almost captured him alive, but his belt had split and that was the only reason he had escaped. He urged his father to stop thinking of war as a game and to ask for peace. Too many brave warriors had been killed, and Pashang's reputation was already ruined. Pashang listened quietly and his eyes filled with tears. Then he reluctantly wrote a letter to Persia's king Kay Kawad. In the letter, he called for the feud that started between Iraj and Tur to be put to an end. He praised Feridun and said the old king made a wise decision when he divided the lands of Iran and Turan and made the Oxus River their border. They should respect this division, as the land was not worth all the fighting the two sides had done over it. The battles had only caused their hair to turn white as snow and the ground to be dyed red with blood. Pashang promised that if Kay Kawad accepted the peace, the people of Turan would stay on their side of the Oxus River and not cross into Persia again. Kay Kawad ultimately agreed to the peace, but he pointed out that Iran had never attacked Turan first. Years before, it was Tur who had murdered Iraj, and this time it was Afrasyab who had invaded Iran and murdered Nozar, and even his own brother Agriras. Kay Kawad accepted Pashang's peace, but he hoped that Afrasyab would keep to it too. When Rostam found out, he went to Kay Kawad and said they should not accept the peace. Instead, he asked the king to set him loose, so he could lead an army into Turan and give them what they deserved. Kay Kawad told Rostam that that would not be just, and that a wise man should never be underhanded or unjust. Then, with the peace declared, Kay Kawad rewarded all of his followers. He granted Rostam rule of Zabolistan and sent many fine treasures to Zal. But Kay Kawad told Rostam to watch the borders and always keep his spears dipped in poison, because whenever there was a kingdom, there was warfare not far away. Kay Kawad ruled Iran for 100 years, and his reign was one of justice and generosity. He had 4 sons, Kay Kaus, Kay Arash, Kay Pashan, and Oshkosh. When he grew old and weak, Kay Kawad summoned Kay Kaus, gave instructions on how to rule, and he warned that if Kaus allowed greed to snare his mind, he would be unsheathing a dark sword that could be used against him. And with that, Kay Kawad died, and Kay Kaus ascended the throne of Persia. Next episode, we will continue on and see if Kay Kaus was able to follow Kay Kawad's last piece of advice. So stay tuned and thank you for listening.